Hey, what's up, guys? Welcome to the channel. UFC 287, Alex Pereira versus Israel Adesanya 2 is almost here. It goes down April 8th in Florida, and this is one of the most stacked UFC pay-per-views of 2023. It is an incredible card. There is a lot to love about UFC 287 because it is stacked from top to bottom with incredible matchups. But this video is going to be the top 3 reasons I love UFC 287. I have a couple honorable mentions, and then I give you my reasons 3 to 1. One being the reason I most love UFC 287. But honestly, I could have made this a top 10 list. That's how incredible UFC 287 is. Now, before I get into any of my reasoning, comment down below what are some reasons that you are most looking forward to UFC 287. I'm curious to hear any of your reasons before I give mine. And also, I'm digging deeper than just, oh, I love this fight. I'm going to give you more, in-depth reasons of why I cannot wait for UFC 287. Starting off with my first honorable mention, and this is a reason that honestly could be on the list, and that is that the UFC 287 prelims are absolutely stacked with incredible fights. I mean, Kelvin Gastelum versus Chris Curtis is an incredible middleweight fight. I know a lot of people are saying Kelvin Gastelum's on his way out. I still believe he is one of the best middleweights in the world. And then you have Chris Curtis coming off that spectacular knockout of Joaquin Buckley. And both guys are never in boring fights. And Kelvin Gastelum, I mean, I dream of a day of potentially seeing him against Israel Adesanya in a rematch because that's one of the best middleweight fights I've ever seen. And Gastelum has been on a bit of a losing streak, and he's kind of been injured and had to pull out of his last few fights. But hopefully he finally makes it to UFC 287 because this matchup with Chris Curtis is absolutely incredible. We know how offensive Kelvin Gastelum can be, throwing combinations, and Chris Curtis has very good defensive boxing. And this is on the prelims. 2 top 15 middleweights on the prelims. And that fight's amazing. And that's not the only great fight on the prelims. You also have Michael Chiesa versus Jingliang on the prelims as well. Incredible fight. Cannot wait for this welterweight matchup. Michael Chiesa has been out for a while. Jingliang had that controversial fight against Daniel Rodriguez back at UFC 279. So a lot of people want to see him get back on the winning track because some people think he won that Daniel Rodriguez fight, but it was razor close. That's an incredible fight. That is a striker versus grappler matchup. Michael Chiesa, it seemed like for a while he may retire and he may not be there anymore. And he's been sitting out for a while. Now he's coming back. He's fighting Jingliang, who's had issues with grapplers in the past. So I think that's a very interesting matchup. Anytime there's a striker versus grappler matchup, I'm always interested in it. And that's just a great fight as well. And you also have Chris Barnett. Chris Barnett, one of the most exciting heavyweights. I know the physique. I know he's never going to be a top heavyweight. But Chris Barnett, I always love to watch Chris Barnett fight. He's fighting Chase Sherman. Not the craziest heavyweight matchup ever, but I am looking forward to it. I mean, to see Chris Barnett get a spinning wheel kick KO and then do that front flip, I hope we see that at UFC 287. Now, this kind of goes along with the prelims being stacked, but my other honorable mention is that Joe Pifer is getting a step up in competition. He came off of Dana White's Contender Series. He got a win in the UFC. The UFC is throwing him to the wolves immediately. And maybe that's a little bit of an exaggeration, but you have Joe Pifer versus Gerald Meerschaert on the early prelims. I cannot wait for this fight. Gerald Meerschaert, I know a lot of people, look at him as a stepping stone because, Khamzat Chimaev went out there in first round, brutally KO'd him, one punch KO'd him. But Gerald Meerschaert since then, a win over Makhmud Muradov, a win over Bruno Silva via submission. And Gerald Meerschaert is a very good fighter. He's not the elite of the elite. He's not the best fighter. He's never really going to be a ranked fighter in the division, but he is a steep test for a newcomer in Joe Pifer, and I'm really looking forward to this matchup. I think this is a great test, to try to understand the skills of Joe Pifer and see where he's at. He's looked incredible, but he hasn't fought the best competition. And Gerald Meerschaert, while he's not a world champion, he's not a top 10 ranked guy, this will give us an answer of where Pifer is in his skill set. There's too many times we see a fighter with a lot of excitement coming up, and then the UFC kind of feeds them easy wins time and time again. Joe Pifer gets one win in the UFC, and now he's on to Gerald Meerschaert, who has spoiled parties before. So I'm really looking forward to that fight, and that's on the early prelims. Now, moving on to my actual list, starting off with number 3, and this is actually similar to one of the honorable mentions, and that is that Adrian Yanez is getting a massive step up in competition against Rob Font. And I know people are going to comment, that's not how you say his name. That is how you say his name. It's not Yanez, it's Yanez. But this fight, Adrian Yanez versus Rob Font, is an incredible bantamweight matchup. The bantamweight division is one of the most stacked divisions in the UFC. And in too many divisions, you see where the veteran guys who are towards the top of the weight class, towards the top of the rankings, not wanting to give some of the up-and-coming talent a chance to kind of steal their spot. We kind of seen it with Arman Tsarukyan and Mateusz Gamrot and Jalen Turner. We kind of seen it Rafael Fiziev, where it seems like we're not going to get these fights. Ultimately, we end up getting some of them with the Beneil Dariush fight and the Justin Gaethje fight. But we see it in divisions like the welterweight division where no one really wanted to give Shavkat Rakhmonov a chance to try to fight his way up the ladder. And in this fight, this is Yanez's toughest fight. He is fighting Rob Font. I understand Rob Font's on a 2-fight losing skid. He lost to Marlon Vera and Jose Aldo in his last 2 fights. That is excellent competition in the bantamweight division. And Rob Font is a very good fighter. He's ranked number 6 in the division. And I love when we see an up-and-coming guy actually get a chance to get that bump up in the rankings, to get a big fight. You know, I want to see Arman Tsarukyan. He's fighting Hanato Moicano, who's behind him in the rankings. Arman Tsarukyan deserves a jump up. Adrian Yanez deserves a jump up. He is getting a jump up against Rob Font, and this is going to be the toughest test of his career. To this point, you know, his last few fights, because he's on like an 8-fight win streak, his last fight's against Tony Kelly. He brutally KO'd him in the first round, but Tony Kelly's an absolute garbage can. Before that, he got a split decision win over Davey Grant. That's a solid win. Before that, a TKO win over Randy Costa. Randy Costa, I don't believe, is in the UFC anymore anyway, along with Tony Kelly's outside the UFC. Yanez has looked incredible, but look at the level of competition he's faced, and I am so excited to see where his skills really are at, because Rob Font has great boxing, is very well-rounded. He doesn't have power, but Rob Font is a very good fighter. He looked very good up until, you know, he ended up running into Jose Aldo and Marlon Vera, where Marlon Vera, he won probably 22 minutes of that Marlon Vera fight, but he just kept getting dropped round after round because Marlon Vera's power was too much and his durability is so good. So ultimately he loses to Marlon Vera. Look where Marlon Vera is now. He's fighting at the top of the division. So this is a great test for Yanez. This is a steep test for Yanez. And I cannot wait to see how Adrian Yanez versus Rob Font plays out at UFC 287. Moving on to my number 2 reason I love UFC 287. And this isn't necessarily a concrete reason, but that is that Gilbert Burns should beat down Jorge Masvidal. Now, Jorge Masvidal used to be one of my favorite fighters. Ever since he brutally KO'd Ben Askren with that 5-second flying knee all the way back in 2019 at UFC 239, Jorge Masvidal has been a changed man. The viral sensation of that KO and the star power that came along with it, and then he went on to fight Nate Diaz and he beat Nate Diaz and his star grew even bigger, has gotten to his head. And he's on a 3-fight losing streak. He got 2 title shots against Kamaru Usman for a win over Nate Diaz, a blown-up lightweight who's on the tail end of his career. He got 2 title shots there. Then he fought Colby Covington, and he got dominated by Colby Covington. And there is some talk about Jorge Masvidal potentially getting a title shot against Leon Edwards. And that is just absolutely ludicrous. That's outlandish. That's completely undeserved. And under no circumstance do I want to see that, even if he were to beat Gilbert Burns at UFC 287. But luckily, Gilbert Burns is a bad stylistic matchup for Jorge Masvidal. And Congressman Masvidal was turning down this fight. He was originally offered this fight for January, but he says, oh, he's working on political things. And he turns down the fight with Gilbert Burns. Gilbert Burns goes out there and absolutely wrecks Neil Magny in the first round, submits him. And now we're finally getting this matchup. And Gilbert Burns has great cardio. He has great grappling, great wrestling, great striking. I understand that people are counting out Masvidal a little bit too much. And I think Masvidal does have a chance in this fight. But I think most likely what we will see in this fight is we will see Gilbert Burns go out there and just bully Jorge Masvidal. He will clinch up with him, push him against the cage, get takedowns. Masvidal might work back to his feet. Burns will get another takedown. And we will end all speculation about Jorge Masvidal getting a title shot against Leon Edwards. Because could you imagine if Masvidal somehow squeaks out a win against Gilbert Burns or somehow KOs Gilbert Burns and he jumps into a title shot? He will be 1-3 in his last 4 fights fighting for the welterweight title. That will be an embarrassment to the sport. So I am really excited. I think Gilbert Burns is a bad matchup for Jorge Masvidal. I think the combination of jiu-jitsu, cardio, pressure of Gilbert Burns will be too much for an aging Jorge Masvidal, who's more worried about other things than actual fighting contenders within the welterweight division. And you got Joe Rogan blowing up his head recently and saying, oh yeah, he would have beat GSP. What a laughable comment that is. That's absolutely ludicrous. And I can't wait. You know, we have all this speculation. Oh, Jorge Masvidal might fight Leon Edwards for the title because the backstory of Jorge Masvidal sucker punching, Leon Edwards all the way back in like 2019 or 2018. I can't even remember at this point. All because of that, we're going to give him a title shot. I can't wait for Gilbert Burns to end all title shot speculation for Jorge Masvidal in the co-main event of UFC 287. Moving on to my number one reason I love UFC 287, and that is the backstory of the main event. This is an incredible backstory. You have Alex Pereira, the new middleweight champion, who defeated Israel Adesanya twice in kickboxing previously, once by KO. He comes over to the UFC and he fights a couple guys and makes his way to a title shot. The UFC signed him because they wanted him to potentially challenge Israel Adesanya for the belt in the future. They gave him Andreas Michailidis. They gave him Sean Strickland, which was the most winnable matchup in the middleweight division stylistically for Alex Pereira. And then he got a title shot. And he got that title shot. And against Israel Adesanya, who he's beaten twice before in very competitive fights. In one fight, in the first kickboxing match, arguably Israel Adesanya should have got the decision. Most people agree that it was a robbery. But he has the KO win over him in kickboxing. He comes over to MMA. This is a totally different sport. And Israel Adesanya, it's a very competitive fight. Israel Adesanya is going to win on the scorecards. And Alex Pereira goes out there in the 5th round and just hunts for the KO and eventually gets a TKO in the 5th round to take the belt off of Israel Adesanya. I know a lot of people, they look at the Conor McGregor trash talk and that's what they enjoy. For me, I love an incredible backstory. I don't need Adesanya and Pereira to be talking trash back and forth. This is an amazing backstory. The fact that he has 2 wins over him in kickboxing, one controversial, the other one Pereira was losing in, and he came back and got the KO, and he was hurt badly in that second kickboxing fight. He follows him over to MMA to be Israel Adesanya's own personal boogeyman. And it looks like Adesanya, the long reigning middleweight champion, is going to defend his belt and get his first win over Alex Pereira in combat sports. And he takes him out in the 5th round, snatches his belt off of him, and now we're having an immediate rematch. And that's not even to mention the fact this is one of the most high-level fights we saw in all of 2022. For some reason, Israel Adesanya versus Alex Pereira 1 gets overlooked. This was an incredible kickboxing fight. I loved every second of this fight. And we had a little bit of grappling mixed in, obviously, where Adesanya, I think it was in like the 3rd round, started to mix in some takedowns. But this was primarily a kickboxing fight where you had Adesanya winning the majority of the rounds. I don't remember exactly what I had it scored going into the 5th. And Pereira takes him out in the 5th round. And now Adesanya has to try to make adjustments, come back and attempt to reclaim his title at UFC 287. Does it get any better than that? There's nothing I enjoy more. I just talked about this with UFC 286. There's nothing I enjoy more than seeing a dominant champion lose their belt and then attempt to come back and reclaim it, especially if in the fight that they lost the belt, they were winning that fight. We talk about Valentina Shevchenko versus Grasso, where Shevchenko, this wasn't as crazy of a fight, but Shevchenko was winning and then gets choked out in the 4th round and loses her belt. That comeback story is going to be compelling, but Israel Adesanya attempting to come back and get the belt off of Alex Pereira is going to be incredible. I'm really looking forward to it. I'm looking forward to that fight in general because no matter who wins, I think it's an incredible fight. And you even add the layer that had Adesanya had 10 more seconds in that 1st round back at UFC 281, we're potentially talking about a 1st round KO win for Israel Adesanya in the last fight. But what is his confidence going to look like? He got stopped by Pereira now twice in combat sports. What is his head going to be like? How does he come back from losing? We've seen him return from losing a decision to Jan Blachowicz, back in, I believe it was 2020. But how is he going to look after returning against Alex Pereira, who has those 3 wins over him in combat sports? I know a lot of people are going to say, oh, he's beat him 3 times. He didn't need this rematch. We absolutely needed this rematch. This is going to be a high-level fight. This is going to be a fight that has a massive amount of hype behind it. And also on top of that, you have the fact Israel Adesanya, he's got a lot of flack for being boring over the past few years. Alex Pereira will not allow that in this fight. This fight will be super exciting, just like UFC 281. I think this is a super compelling fight. I think it's an amazing storyline. I think it has the highest stakes possible on the line, because if Adesanya loses this fight, his path to a middleweight title, as long as Alex Pereira is in the division, is non-existent. So there couldn't be higher stakes on the line for Israel Adesanya. And what an incredible story UFC 287's main event is. I can't wait for this card. This card is just so stacked with incredible fights. I am so excited. But let me know what you guys think down in the comments. Do you think I missed any reasons that I should have mentioned of why I love UFC 287? And don't forget to comment down below what you think are your reasons you're most looking forward to UFC 287. I'm genuinely curious. Don't forget to check out my video, the top 3 reasons I hate UFC 287. I will link that down in the description as well as the end cards. Don't forget to like the video, and thank you so much for watching.